When James Collins is fired for helping a disabled man, he assumes it's just a case of corporate rigidity. But as the fight for his job spirals into a legal battle, he uncovers something darker: hidden biases and systemic discrimination lurking beneath the surface. With his life on the line, James must decide whether to walk away or face the forces determined to keep him down. What happens next will shake the very foundation of everything he thought he knew about justice, fairness, and forgiveness. Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now let's dive in. James Collins navigated through the familiar streets leading to his office building, feeling the warmth of the early morning sun against his face. It was a beautiful day, but the tension that simmered beneath the surface of his thoughts was hard to shake. His job at the corporate office had always been demanding, but lately it felt like the pressure was mounting from all directions. James had always prided himself on being punctual and reliable, values his father had instilled in him from a young age. But today was different. The subway had been delayed, and now he was racing against time to make it to the office on time. A glance at his watch showed that he was already a few minutes behind schedule. He picked up his pace, his briefcase swinging at his side, the coffee in his other hand now lukewarm. As he neared the building, James spotted something unusual out of the corner of his eye. An older man in a wheelchair was positioned awkwardly at the entrance, struggling to push open the heavy glass door. His arms shook with the effort, and several papers teetered precariously on his lap. Instinctively, James slowed down, feeling a tug of responsibility. He couldn't just walk by and ignore this man's difficulty. It wasn't in his nature. He looked at the building's entrance, then back at the man. Every second he hesitated was another second closer to being late. But something inside him wouldn't let him continue without stopping. He jogged over, setting his briefcase down as he reached for the door. "Here, let me help you with that," James said, offering a warm smile as he held the door wide open. The man looked up, surprise flashing across his face, followed by relief. "Thank you, young man. I've been struggling with this thing for 5 minutes. These doors aren't exactly friendly to people like me," he said with a small chuckle, his breath still heavy from the effort. James nodded, feeling the weight of the man's words. "It's no problem. These doors are pretty ridiculous." Once inside, the man shifted in his wheelchair to balance his papers. He glanced at James, gratitude etched in the lines of his tired face. "You're the first person who's stopped to help me today. People just rush by without a second glance." James felt a pang of sadness. "We've got to look out for each other," he said quietly. He checked his watch again. Late. Definitely late. He didn't want to abandon the man, but his heart began to pound harder, knowing his boss, Mr. Howard, wouldn't take kindly to this excuse. But how could he not stop? "Are you all set from here?" James asked, glancing toward the elevator. "Yes, I'll be fine now. Thank you again," the man said, his voice sincere. James gave him a nod and hurried toward the elevators. His mind raced as he punched the button, willing the elevator to move faster. By the time he reached the 3rd floor and the doors slid open, his stomach dropped. Standing by his desk, arms crossed, was Mr. Howard. The thin, balding man glared at James through his glasses, his sharp features set in a disapproving scowl. "Late again, Collins?" His voice was cold, each word carefully enunciated to deliver maximum sting. James opened his mouth to explain, but Mr. Howard cut him off with a raised hand. "I don't want to hear it. You've been cutting it close too many times lately. We expect punctuality in this office, and tardiness reflects poorly on your commitment." "I was helping someone get through the door," James blurted, unable to keep quiet. An older man in a wheelchair was struggling. "I said no excuses," Mr. Howard snapped. His eyes flicked to the clock on the wall. "You were late. End of discussion. Now, get to your desk." James bit his tongue, frustration and disbelief swirling in his chest. He had always worked hard, always stayed late to meet deadlines, yet none of that seemed to matter to Mr. Howard. To him, lateness, even by a few minutes, was the ultimate sin. With a curt nod, James made his way to his desk, where the weight of the morning settled on his shoulders. The day dragged on, each task feeling heavier than usual. James couldn't shake the nagging sense of unfairness. It wasn't as if he had been slacking off. He had simply chosen to help someone. Was that really something to be punished for? By the time the end of the workday arrived, James was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. He glanced at the clock, wondering if he should approach Mr. Howard to explain what had really happened, to try and reason with him. But before he could make a decision, an email notification popped up on his screen. It was from Human Resources. Subject: Meeting Request. James frowned and opened the email. It was a brief message asking him to come down to the HR office immediately. His stomach tightened as he reread the message. What could this be about? He made his way to HR, his thoughts racing. Had Mr. Howard reported him for being late again? Surely they wouldn't fire him for something as minor as this. He had been with the company for 3 years and had always maintained a good record. When he arrived at the HR office, Miss Peterson, the HR manager, greeted him with a tight-lipped smile. She motioned for him to sit down across from her desk. "James, thank you for coming in," she said, her tone professional, but not warm. "Is there a problem?" James asked, his anxiety growing by the second. Miss Peterson hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I'm afraid we've made the decision to terminate your employment, effective immediately." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He blinked, struggling to comprehend what she had just said. "What? Terminate? Why?" Miss Peterson sighed, looking down at the papers in front of her. "The decision came from higher up. Your recent attendance issues were a factor." "Attendance issues?" James repeated, incredulous. "I've been late a handful of times, and today I was late because I was helping someone who needed assistance." Miss Peterson nodded, her expression neutral. "I understand, but the decision has already been made." James sat there in stunned silence. His mind whirled, searching for something to say, something that could change her mind. But he knew, deep down, that it wouldn't make a difference. The decision was final. With a heavy heart, James stood and left the office. The elevator ride down felt like it took hours, each floor passing by in slow motion. By the time he stepped outside into the evening air, he felt as though the world had shifted beneath his feet. Everything had changed in a matter of minutes, and the future suddenly felt uncertain, like the ground he had once stood on had crumbled away. All for helping a man in need. James sat on the train home, staring blankly at the passing buildings, but his mind was elsewhere. The hum of the train, the chatter of passengers, and the cityscape outside barely registered in his thoughts. He replayed the conversation with Miss Peterson over and over again in his head, still trying to comprehend the weight of the words, terminated, effective immediately. How had things spiraled so quickly? The real injustice stung sharply. All he'd done was help a man, a small act of kindness that anyone should have felt proud to do. But instead, it cost him his livelihood. He clenched his hands into fists, feeling the frustration boil in his chest. This was wrong. It felt like an invisible force, something bigger than just a policy, had targeted him. And yet, there was no one to argue with, no one to protest to, and no way to reverse what had already been done. The train rattled to a stop, jolting him from his thoughts. His station. With a weary sigh, he stood and stepped out, the late afternoon light casting long shadows on the ground. As he walked the familiar path home, a new dread began to rise inside him. He had to tell Karen. Karen had always been his rock, the person who kept him grounded even in the toughest of times. She believed in him, in the value of his work, and in the strength of their partnership. But the news he was about to bring home would shake everything. How would they manage with just one income? How would they explain this to the kids? His stomach churned at the thought of their worried faces. As he unlocked the door to their modest apartment, the familiar sounds of home greeted him. The laughter of his children, the clatter of dishes from the kitchen, and the soft hum of music playing in the background. For a moment, the normalcy felt jarring, as if his life outside those doors no longer matched the world inside. "Hey, you're home a little early," Karen called from the kitchen. Her voice bright and full of warmth. She appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her blonde hair falling loosely over her shoulders. "How was your day?" James froze in the entryway, unsure of how to start. He wanted to delay it, to hold on to the illusion of normalcy for just a few more minutes. But he couldn't. The weight of what had happened was too heavy to carry alone. "Karen, we need to talk," he said, his voice lower than usual. Her smile faltered. She stepped closer, her eyes scanning his face, sensing the tension. What's wrong? James took a deep breath, forcing the words out. I lost my job today. The silence that followed was thick, as if the room itself had held its breath. Karen's eyes widened, and she reached for his arm instinctively. What? Why? What happened? He explained everything in halting words, starting with the man in the wheelchair, the delay, and Mr. Howard's reaction. As he spoke, Karen listened intently, her expression shifting from disbelief to anger to confusion. When he finished, her hands were shaking slightly as she lowered them from his arm. They fired you for that? She asked, her voice incredulous. You were helping someone, James. How can they justify firing you for being late once, especially for something like that? James shook his head, frustration thick in his throat. I don't know, I guess. Mr. Howard had been keeping track of my time. He's always been hard on me, but this feels like it came out of nowhere. Karen sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the floor as if searching for answers. What are we going to do? She whispered, more to herself than to him. James sank into the chair across from her, feeling the weight of her questions settle over them both. What were they going to do? He had always been the steady provider, and while Karen's work as a part-time teacher helped, it wasn't nearly enough to cover all their expenses. The thought of explaining this to their kids, to their landlord, to their family, it all felt overwhelming. We'll figure it out, he said, though the words felt hollow. I'll start looking for something else tomorrow. Maybe I can find something temporary until I get back on my feet. Karen nodded slowly, but the doubt was clear in her eyes. The uncertainty of the situation loomed large, and they both knew that finding another job in this economy wasn't going to be easy, especially when it came with no warning, no severance pay, and no explanation beyond lateness. That night, the tension in the air hung heavy. Dinner was quieter than usual, the kids picking up on the change in atmosphere, despite their parents' attempts to act normal. Their youngest, Sophia, noticed first. Dad, why aren't you smiling? She asked, her small voice cutting through the silence. She looked up at him with her innocent eyes, her fork poised in midair, waiting for an answer. James forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. I'm just tired, sweetheart. It's been a long day. Sophia seemed to accept that answer for now, but their older son, Caleb, wasn't so easily convinced. He watched his father carefully, his brow furrowing, but said nothing. James knew they would have to tell the kids soon, but tonight wasn't the night. Tonight, they needed the illusion of normalcy just a little longer. After the kids were in bed, James and Karen sat together on the couch, the quiet of the apartment pressing in on them. Karen leaned her head on his shoulder, and he could feel the tension in her body, the unspoken fears she was trying to suppress. I hate this, she whispered. I hate that they did this to you. It's not fair, James. I know, he replied, his voice hoarse. It's not fair, but we'll get through it. We always do. But even as he said the words, doubt gnawed at him. How could something so unjust happen, and how were they supposed to fight back? They didn't have the resources to go up against a corporation. They were just one family, trying to survive in a system that seemed determined to crush them. The next few days were a blur of uncertainty. James spent hours scouring job listings, sending out resumes, and making phone calls, but nothing seemed to stick. The weight of the situation bore down on him, and as the days passed, the sense of hopelessness grew stronger. Meanwhile, the news of James' firing had spread through the office. While some of his co-workers were sympathetic, others whispered behind closed doors, their own biases coloring their views. Some supported Mr. Howard's decision, chalking it up to corporate policy, while others were outraged at the blatant injustice. One person in particular, Emily, a colleague who had always been friendly with James, couldn't shake her own sense of unease about the whole situation. She had witnessed James' dedication to his work, and she knew that his firing had more to do with something unspoken, something deeper. It wasn't long before word of James' firing reached Mr. Oliver, the disabled man James had helped that fateful morning. When he learned what had happened, he was furious. Mr. Oliver returned to the office the next day, determined to speak with someone about the injustice. He approached the front desk, his voice firm but respectful. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Howard, please." The receptionist glanced at her computer. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Mr. Oliver replied, his frustration barely contained. "But I think he'll want to hear what I have to say." As he waited, Mr. Oliver thought about how people like James, people who went out of their way to help others, were often punished in ways that defied reason. He wasn't going to let this slide, not if he could do something about it. What he didn't know was that this was just the beginning of a much larger fight. A fight that would uncover hidden prejudices, challenge perceptions, and ultimately change the course of more lives than just James Collins. Days turned into weeks, and for James Collins, each one felt heavier than the last. His mornings were no longer spent in the familiar rush to catch the subway or prepare for a busy workday. Instead, they were spent at the kitchen table, his laptop open to countless job boards, emails, and rejection letters. The silence of the house felt suffocating as he watched his inbox, waiting for some spark of hope, but none came. Karen, in her quiet resilience, kept her routine steady. She returned to her part-time teaching job and did her best to stay optimistic. But even with her efforts, James could see the toll this was taking on her. Every night after the kids went to bed, they would sit together, have Karen softly encouraging him to not lose hope. But James could see it in her eyes. She was scared too. Then one morning, just as James was about to dive into yet another round of job applications, there was a knock at the door. When he opened it, Mr. Oliver, the man he had helped at the office, was sitting outside in his wheelchair, his expression serious but kind. "James," Mr. Oliver began, "I heard what happened at your job after that morning. You got fired because of what you did, didn't you?" James felt a mix of emotions rush through him: embarrassment, frustration, but also relief. At least someone else understood the absurdity of what had happened. "Yeah," James sighed. "I did. They said it was because I was late, but we both know that's not the real reason." Mr. Oliver nodded solemnly. "I thought as much. Look, I'm not going to pretend I understand what you're going through, but I know this isn't right. I've faced my own share of unfair treatment over the years because of my disability. People think just because they're in power, they can do whatever they want to those they see as beneath them. But it's not fair, James, and it's not right." James leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed as he listened. He appreciated Mr. Oliver's support, but he didn't know what could be done. He had tried to move on, to find a new job, but nothing had worked out so far. The thought of trying to fight this felt overwhelming. "I came here today because I want to help," Mr. Oliver continued. "I don't have much, but I have connections. I've spoken with a lawyer friend of mine who deals with workplace discrimination cases. I told him about your situation, and he's interested in helping. You shouldn't have to just accept what happened to you." James looked down at the man in the wheelchair, his heart swelling with gratitude. This stranger, whom he had helped on a whim, was now offering him something invaluable, a chance to fight back. "I don't know what to say," James murmured, overwhelmed by the gesture. "I didn't expect. I wasn't sure there was anything I could do." "There's always something you can do," Mr. Oliver said firmly. "The question is, are you willing to stand up for yourself?" James thought about it. The idea of taking on the company, of challenging Mr. Howard and the entire system that had so carelessly discarded him, felt daunting. But the more he thought about it, the more the fire in his chest began to grow. He had been wronged, and it wasn't just about him. It was about people like Mr. Oliver too, people who were marginalized, pushed aside, and dismissed simply because of who they were. This wasn't just about his job anymore. It was about fighting back against something much bigger. "I'm in," James finally said, his voice steady with newfound determination. "Let's do this." The next few days were a whirlwind of meetings and phone calls. Mr. Oliver's lawyer, Mr. Reed, was a sharp, no-nonsense man who had taken on numerous discrimination cases over the years. He listened intently as James recounted the details of his firing, nodding thoughtfully as he took notes. "It's clear you were targeted," Mr. Reed said at their first meeting. "The question is whether we can prove that this was motivated by something more than just lateness." "I believe we can. We'll need to gather evidence, emails, performance reviews, witness statements, anything that can show this wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of bias." James felt a surge of hope. This was no longer just about finding another job. This was about justice. But the process was slow, and every day without work was another day of financial strain. Karen picked up extra shifts at the school, but it wasn't enough. The bills were piling up, and their savings were dwindling fast. One evening, as James sat at the kitchen table with Karen, going over their finances, there was a knock at the door. When James opened it, he found Emily, one of his former co-workers, standing nervously on the porch. "James, I've been meaning to talk to you," she said, her voice shaky but resolute. "I heard about what happened, and I want to help." James frowned, confused. "How do you mean?" Emily stepped inside, lowering her voice. "I've seen the way Mr. Howard treats you. I've seen it for a while, actually. It's not just about you being late that day. He's had it out for you for a long time, and I think it's because of the way you look." James felt his chest tighten. It wasn't the first time someone had implied that Mr. Howard's treatment of him was racially motivated, but hearing it said out loud felt different. It was one thing to suspect it, but another thing entirely to have someone else confirm it. "I'm not saying I know for sure," Emily continued quickly, "but I've seen enough to know that something's not right. He's harder on you than anyone else. He watches you like a hawk, and I've overheard him making comments." James's mind raced as Emily's words sank in. Mr. Howard had always been tough on him, but he'd never been able to put his finger on why. Now, things were starting to make sense. "I want to testify for you," Emily said, her voice steady. "I'll tell the truth about what I've seen, and I know a few other people who might be willing to speak up too. You don't have to go through this alone, James." For the first time in weeks, James felt a flicker of hope. With Emily's testimony and the support of Mr. Oliver and Mr. Reed, he began to believe that he might actually have a chance. Maybe, just maybe, they could take on the system and win. But the fight ahead wouldn't be easy. The company wasn't going to roll over and admit they were wrong. And as the case gained attention, the media started to pick up on the story. James found himself thrust into the public eye, his name and face appearing in news articles and on television. Some people rallied behind him, outraged by the injustice he had faced, while others criticized him, accusing him of playing the victim. The stress of the media attention weighed heavily on James. Every time he opened his phone, there were new messages, some supportive, but others filled with hateful comments. Karen did her best to shield the kids from the worst of it, but even they could sense the tension in the air. One evening, as James scrolled through yet another round of news articles about his case, he sighed heavily and set his phone down. "I don't know how much more of this I can take," he admitted, his voice weary. Karen reached across the table and took his hand. "You're not alone in this," she reminded him softly. "We're in this together, and we're going to see it through. You're fighting for what's right, and that's never easy." James nodded, appreciating her support, but the weight of the fight still bore down on him. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for his family, for Mr. Oliver, for everyone who had ever been wronged by a system that seemed designed to keep people like him down. And so, with the support of his family, his friends, and his newfound allies, James prepared for the battle ahead. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just a man who had been fired unjustly. He was a man who was going to stand up and fight for what was right. And that fight had only just begun. The courtroom was packed. It seemed like everyone had an opinion about James Collins and his fight for justice. His case had become more than a simple wrongful termination lawsuit. It had become a symbol of the everyday struggles people like James faced in their jobs, their communities, and their lives. The media attention had swelled, bringing in reporters, activists, and people from all walks of life who felt a connection to James's story. But with the attention came pressure. And not just for James. For Mr. Howard, the supervisor who had fired him, the case was a growing headache. As more people stepped forward, testifying about his treatment of certain employees, especially those from minority backgrounds, the narrative shifted. What had begun as a straightforward dismissal had quickly unraveled into a wider examination of prejudice, power, and responsibility. The corporate office, which had initially backed Mr. Howard, was now quietly distancing itself from him. worried about its public image. They knew that this case wasn't just about James anymore. It was about the very fabric of how they treated their employees and how much scrutiny they could withstand. James, meanwhile, sat beside his lawyer, Mr. Reed, feeling a strange mixture of nerves and determination. The courtroom atmosphere was heavy, filled with whispers and the occasional click of cameras. His wife, Karen, sat just behind him, holding her breath every time someone took the stand. Mr. Oliver, the disabled man James had helped, had been among the first to testify, and his words had set the tone for the entire trial. "I've been coming to that building for years," Mr. Oliver had said in his calm, measured voice, "and I've seen people walk past me like I was invisible. But not James. He didn't think twice before helping me. That kind of humanity should be celebrated, not punished." His testimony had brought murmurs of agreement from the courtroom. People were beginning to see that what happened to James wasn't just a legal technicality, it was a reflection of something much deeper. The subtle ways that kindness, empathy, and fairness could be trampled by rigid rules, hidden biases, and a system designed to maintain the status quo. The real turning point, though, came when Emily took the stand. She had been nervous at first, glancing toward Mr. Howard as if expecting a reprimand. But when she started speaking, her voice grew stronger. "I've worked with James for over 3 years, she began. "In that time, I've seen how dedicated he is, how much effort he puts into his job. But I've also seen how Mr. Howard treated him differently. I can't say why exactly, but there was always this extra scrutiny. I've heard Mr. Howard make comments about James when he wasn't around, comments about people like him. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back now, it's clear that there was something more going on." Emily's words hung in the air, heavy with implication. James felt a knot form in his stomach. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed, knowing that his efforts at work had been overshadowed by something he couldn't control, filled him with a deep sadness. How long had this been happening without him fully realizing it? How many other people like him had been silently judged, pushed aside, or punished for no reason other than who they were? Mr. Howard shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly aware that the tide was turning against him. He had come into this trial confident, believing that he could hide behind company policies and vague justifications. But now, with every word from the witnesses, his defenses were crumbling. The company's lawyers, sensing the shift, had remained surprisingly quiet, choosing not to press too hard. They knew that fighting back too aggressively might only make things worse. As the trial progressed, James found himself reflecting more and more on the nature of empathy. It wasn't something you could quantify in company policies or performance reviews, yet it was the very thing that had set everything in motion. His act of kindness, helping Mr. Oliver through the door that day, had been instinctual, a simple gesture of goodwill. But it had revealed something deeper about the world he lived in, about how people were treated, how value was assigned based on superficial traits rather than the content of someone's character. The media had latched onto this narrative, framing the case as a battle between compassion and corporate rigidity, between an unjust system and a man who had done nothing more than the right thing. Every news outlet had a take, some focusing on James's integrity, while others questioned why such a small act of tardiness had led to such a massive legal battle. Public opinion, however, was largely on James' side. On social media, hashtags like #JusticeForJames and Empathy Matters trended for weeks. People shared their own stories of workplace discrimination, of being overlooked, and of feeling powerless in the face of unjust treatment. It was as though James had tapped into a collective wound, one that was now being exposed for all to see. But for James, the real heart of the issue was more personal. He had been raised to believe that kindness was a strength, not a weakness. His parents had always taught him to treat others with respect, no matter their background or circumstances. They had lived through their own struggles, and they had passed down their belief in the importance of lifting others up whenever possible. Yet here he was, fighting for his very livelihood because he had chosen to help a man in need. As the trial neared its conclusion, Mr. Reed delivered a closing argument that echoed the thoughts swirling in James' mind. Standing before the jury, Mr. Reed spoke not just about the technicalities of the law, but about the broader implications of the case. "This is not just about whether James Collins was late to work," Mr. Reed began, his voice steady and clear. "This is about the kind of world we want to live in, a world where doing the right thing, where helping someone in need is valued, not punished. A world where people are judged by their actions and their character, not by outdated stereotypes or unspoken biases." He gestured toward James, who sat quietly at the defense table. James Collins did what any decent human being would do. He saw someone struggling, and he offered his help, but instead of being rewarded for his kindness, he was penalized. This case is not just about a job. It's about justice. It's about empathy. It's about the kind of society we want to build, one where we lift each other up, not tear each other down. The jury deliberated for several hours, and during that time the courtroom buzzed with speculation. People whispered their predictions, reporters scribbled in their notebooks, and James sat beside Karen, holding her hand as they waited for the verdict. His heart raced, but deep down, he knew that whatever the outcome, he had done the right thing by standing up for himself. Finally, the jury returned and the foreman stood to deliver the verdict. The room fell silent as the judge asked for their decision. "We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, James Collins," the foreman announced. A wave of relief washed over James. He exhaled, his body trembling as the weight of months of uncertainty and stress lifted. Karen squeezed his hand, tears welling in her eyes. Around the courtroom, people murmured their approval. Even Mr. Oliver, sitting in the back, smiled and nodded. The judge awarded James not only monetary compensation, but also a formal apology from the company. The ruling was clear. James had been wronged, and his act of kindness had been punished unjustly. But beyond the legal victory, something more significant had been achieved. The trial had shone a light on the quiet injustices that so many people faced in their daily lives. It had sparked conversations about discrimination, empathy, and the ways in which society treated those who didn't fit neatly into preconceived molds. Outside the courthouse, as James stood in front of a crowd of supporters and reporters, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. Not just for the victory, but for the people who had stood by him: Karen, Mr. Oliver, Emily, and all the others who had believed in him. When asked by a reporter how he felt about the outcome, James paused for a moment, reflecting on everything that had brought him to this point. "I didn't do this just for myself," he said finally, his voice calm but resolute. "I did this for everyone who's ever been overlooked, mistreated, or pushed aside for reasons beyond their control. Kindness shouldn't come with a price. And if standing up for that means going through what I did, then it's a price I'm willing to pay." The weeks following the trial felt surreal to James. He had expected to feel a sense of finality once the verdict was announced, a clean end to the chapter of his life that had been dominated by the fight for justice. But instead, it felt like something new had been born. His name, once just another cog in the corporate wheel, had become synonymous with resilience, with standing up for what was right in a world that too often turned a blind eye to injustice. People reached out to him, strangers from across the country, sending messages of support and gratitude. They shared their own stories of discrimination, of being overlooked, and of fighting back against systems that seemed rigged against them. It was overwhelming at times, the weight of these personal stories settling on his shoulders. But it was also deeply humbling. His fight had become their fight, too. James had been offered his old job back, but he had declined. There was no going back to that office, to that world where he had been reduced to a number, a ticking clock of performance metrics. It wasn't just about the job anymore. He realized that his experiences had fundamentally changed him. His priorities had shifted. He didn't want to simply return to the life he had before. He wanted to use what had happened to him to make a difference for others. That's when Mr. Oliver approached him with an idea. They met in a small coffee shop a few blocks away from the courthouse. The trial may have been over, but their bond had only grown stronger through the ordeal. "I've been thinking a lot about what we could do with this momentum," Mr. Oliver began, his voice measured but full of purpose. "What if we started something together? An organization that advocates for workplace fairness? A way to help people who are going through what you went through. James looked at him, his mind racing. It wasn't something he had ever considered, but now that Mr. Oliver had mentioned it, the idea began to take root. He thought about all the people who had reached out to him, people who had no one to fight for them, no resources to take on corporations or systemic discrimination. People like him, who had been wronged but didn't have the means or support to stand up. "I don't know anything about running a nonprofit," James admitted, his brow furrowing. "But I can't just sit back and do nothing, not after everything that's happened." Mr. Oliver smiled, his eyes twinkling with a quiet determination. "We'll figure it out. Besides, you're not alone in this. There are people who believe in what you're doing. We can build something real, something that helps people." James nodded, the weight of the responsibility already settling over him. But this time it didn't feel like a burden, it felt like a calling. "Let's do it," he said, the conviction in his voice solidifying the decision. In the months that followed, James and Mr. Oliver launched their organization, Fair Work Advocates, with the mission of providing legal assistance, resources, and support to those facing workplace discrimination. Emily, who had played such a crucial role in his case, joined them as their communications director, helping to raise awareness and build connections with communities across the country. What started as a small operation quickly grew. They held workshops on workplace rights, partnered with lawyers to offer pro bono services to those who couldn't afford representation, and lobbied for policy changes at both the local and national levels. The organization gained traction, and before long, James found himself being asked to speak at events, on panels, and even in front of lawmakers. At first, the attention felt strange to him. He wasn't someone who had ever craved the spotlight. He had always been content working quietly, doing his part to provide for his family. But now he understood that his voice carried weight, that his story could inspire others to stand up for themselves and for what was right. And so he embraced it, not out of a desire for fame, but out of a deep sense of responsibility to those who needed someone to speak for them. One evening, after a long day of meetings and calls, James sat on the porch of their modest home, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Karen joined him, sitting beside him with a cup of tea in her hands. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the quiet hum of the neighborhood around them. "I'm proud of you, you know," Karen said softly, her voice filled with warmth. "You've come so far since all of this started." James smiled, leaning back in his chair. "I couldn't have done it without you." Karen reached over, taking his hand in hers. "You would have found your way, but I'm glad I could walk with you through it." James squeezed her hand, feeling a swell of gratitude for the woman who had stood by him through the darkest moments. They had weathered so much together, and yet they had emerged stronger, more united. It wasn't just about surviving anymore, it was about thriving, about building something meaningful. As they sat there, watching the stars begin to twinkle in the sky, a familiar figure appeared at the edge of their driveway. It was Mr. Howard. The man looked older than James remembered, his posture slightly hunched as he approached the porch. James hadn't seen him since the trial ended, and the sight of his former supervisor stirred a mix of emotions: anger, pity, and, strangely enough, curiosity. Mr. Howard stopped a few feet from the porch, clearing his throat awkwardly. "James," he began, his voice rough. "I hope I'm not intruding. I needed to talk to you." James exchanged a glance with Karen, who gave him a small nod before standing and heading inside, leaving the two men alone. James stood, crossing his arms as he faced Mr. Howard. "What do you want?" James asked, his tone neither harsh nor welcoming. "Mr. Howard shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping to the ground. "I've had a lot of time to think about what happened, about how I handled things, how I handled you." James remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "I made a mistake," Mr. Howard admitted, his voice low. "More than one, actually. I've been angry for a long time, at the world, at myself, and I took it out on people who didn't deserve it. Especially you. I fired you because I thought you didn't belong. And that was wrong." James felt a flicker of surprise at the man's candidness. He had expected excuses, maybe even a denial, but this was different. "I can't undo what I did," Mr. Howard continued, his voice faltering slightly. But I want to say I'm sorry. I've lost my job. The company let me go after everything came to light. It's been a humbling experience, to say the least. James studied the man before him, seeing the weight of regret in his eyes. Mr. Howard, the man who had once held all the power, was now standing in front of him, asking for forgiveness. And in that moment, James realized that holding on to his anger wasn't going to change anything. The real power wasn't in retribution, it was in letting go. I appreciate you coming here to say that, James said after a long pause. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand why you did what you did, but I accept your apology. Mr. Howard looked up, his expression one of relief mixed with shame. Thank you, James. I don't expect anything more, but I hope you know I'm trying to be better. With a final nod, Mr. Howard turned and walked away, leaving James alone on the porch. As he watched the man disappear into the night, James felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. He hadn't expected this ending, hadn't expected to find closure in the form of an apology from the very person who had wronged him. But in a way, it felt right. Karma had a way of balancing the scales, not through punishment but through transformation. People like Mr. Howard could change. And James had learned that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It meant moving forward. Years later, Fair Work advocates had grown into a national movement. James continued to work tirelessly, advocating for workplace fairness and equal treatment. He became a symbol of perseverance, not just because of his fight, but because of his willingness to embrace empathy and redemption, even in the face of his own pain. In the end, James Collins had found more than justice. He had found purpose. And through his journey, he had proven that sometimes the most powerful act of resistance was kindness, and the most meaningful victories were the ones that came from the heart. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.